In order to understand how I am able to send more than 230 letters to officials in the last 4 years to unveil money laundering in Germany, besides working 60 to 70 hours a week, you have to know my personal background. In addition to my parents, who were self-employed craftsmen, both of my grandparents' families, my aunts and uncles, were entrepreneurs. From an early age, working in our parents' business after school was just natural for us. Back when I sowed wild oats, I not only gave up my political commitment after I found out how dishonest even local politics already are. Socially, too, the tracks have changed for me to be more culturally open-minded. This also meant giving up the socially acceptable consumption of alcohol one day and trying out the advantages and disadvantages of other narcotics without prejudice. After my experiences with sometimes excessive alcohol consumption, I quickly realized that cocaine and amphetamines would not be good for me and thus strictly rejected them. The benefits of cannabis have outweighed the dangers in my early opinion. Nevertheless, at that moment, one found oneself in illegality. One of the undesirable side effects of this was having to participate in the so-called black market. The lack of an open market leads to a latent shortage, and thus necessitates the logistical challenge of finding sources of supply. Due to my entrepreneurial roots, I was already used to be responsible with my financial resources from an early age. This also meant that I was not only able to reliably solve the logistical challenges for myself, my circle of friends also took advantage of my organizational talent. As a child of the 1990s, at a time when youth culture was developing rapidly through electronic music, my circle of friends also developed rapidly. From the occasional helping out among friends, a market-dominant position for cannabis in East Hesse has developed within 3 to 4 years. What has had a positive effect on my lifestyle on the one hand has set me back in achieving my study goal on the other hand. As expected, these developments could not go unnoticed, especially since my large family is traditionally not unknown in the region. Due to the exposed location of my apartment, sooner or later it had to happen that I was allowed to observe how the regional criminal police took up a position in the opposite house. At this point in time, an undercover investigator from the Hessian State Criminal Police Office had already crept in on me. As is known from undercover investigators, they not only watch, but also participate and promote criminal behavior. Since my entrepreneurial skills not only attracted the attention of the judiciary in Fulda, but also of the State Criminal Police Office, I was repeatedly asked by the undercover investigator to expand my activities to the entire spectrum of narcotics. Since you can't sell what you don't know, I've always refused. Under the promise of a lucrative business model, however, I followed the undercover investigator with another offer. In a cooperation with a rather sleazebag, it turned out that the undercover agent not just sells every imaginable narcotic. It was also the case that he did business with prostitution. Suddenly, I not only found myself in a milieu that is very strongly characterized by violence, a behavioral pattern that I fundamentally reject, it also became apparent that the undercover investigator didn't just want to move me into the red light milieu. The undercover agent and his accomplice had connections to Romania in order to buy underage girls from there and force them into prostitution in Germany. At that point, I pulled the ripcord and dismissed the undercover agent. However, that meant that I was no longer really interesting for the judiciary in Fulda and the Hessian State Criminal Police Office, which back then was under the political responsibility of the Hessian Minister of the Interior, Volker Bouffier. After I went back to my roots and the trade in cannabis, the German judiciary once again dropped its mask and showed its true face. Out of my circle of friends, once again another undercover investigator or a straw man got put into my face under the pretense of buying interests. Of course, no deal should come about. Rather, I was confronted with the question of whether I was worried about my safety and whether it would not be better to buy me safety from the judicial authorities. Pointing out that cannabis is probably the least dangerous substance of all legal and illegal narcotics and that I reject other narcotics, I have refused to pay protection money to the judiciary. The answer was not long in the coming. In society, you always come across weak personalities who allow themselves to be blackmailed. One day, it turned out that a friend didn't pick up an order day in and day out. One day, I was too careless and didn't deposit the order outside the house again. The criminal police in the house across the street noticed this, so the next morning a house search took place. It all went relatively unspectacular. After all, they knew exactly where to find what and when. Nothing was left to chance. As expected, pre-trial detention was released, which was not surprising given the accusation. The scheme of action practiced by the judiciary and proven by experience to be effective should be applied to me. My case isn't the first time one has had to question whether an undercover cop's job is to fight crime or encourage it. It was therefore also clear that the judiciary was not concerned with punishment, but rather with enforcing their demand for protection money. The following intimidation tactics should be fully maxed out on me. In a situation like mine, you reflexively reach for the supposedly best lawyer in town. After a while, it turned out that apart from the usual promises made by the Fulda lawyer Karis, nothing was moving. Instead, I was left in detention without a clue, without information or perspective. To increase the emotional pressure, my family got granted visitation rights. Questions to the lawyer and the court were not answered. Then I realized that this show was only intended to soften me up to pay the protection money they were asking for. As a reaction to this, I revoked the mandate of the lawyer Karis with immediate effect while I was still in custody. After his deputy couldn't dissuade me from my decision, after 5 weeks in prison, I suddenly had a detention review date the next day in the presence of the formerly dismissed lawyer Karis, and was released immediately. It was clear to the judiciary and to Mr. Karis that their intimidation game had been blown, and that I would report the fraud to the other inmates. This had to be avoided at all costs. In the years 2000 to 2002, I handled a total of around 200 kilograms of cannabis in East Hesse. Sounds like a lot, but it isn't. On March 18, 2003, I was convicted by the District Court of Fulda under file number 2G6412/02 balls for trading 4 kilograms. It sounds like little, but it isn't. At that time, a prison sentence of several years would have been expected on this scale. The concern of the judiciary was not punishment, but the payment of protection money. That's why I got requested to hire a lawyer from Fulda. But I didn't do that. With a mild suspended sentence, it was assumed that I had learned my lesson, to no longer withhold the payments, and carried on like before. But I didn't do that. I never made myself a lackey of a corrupt judiciary, because I never was a criminal. Instead, I left the city and completed my studies on business administration in another city within the standard period, and a diploma in accounting, taxation, and controlling. After my studies, I worked in a large German group, first in sales, and then in regulatory reporting for the group bank. However, my criminal record always kept me from a career. A pardon was rejected by the Federal Ministry of Justice. When the ECB cleared the job market in my industry in 2014, I saw my chance and was able to become self-employed as a consultant, despite not having the desired professional experience as usually expected, thus taking advantage of the German bank's desperate need for suitable staff. Since my conviction, I never had the opportunity to prove that the judiciary in Fulda had been extorting protection money. At the beginning of 2017, I was commissioned to advise Wirecard Bank on regulatory reporting. A lot of what I saw there struck me as extremely suspicious. However, I had only seen the banking business, which, despite poor management of the bank, did not allow my attention to be pointed at the money laundering in the group. With the bankruptcy of the company, the information that became known to me in this context and my previous knowledge of its banking business, the pieces of the puzzle were put together for me. With reference to my criminal complaint against unknown persons because of money laundering, and against the board members of Wirecard AG at the Munich Public Prosecutor's Office from January 28, 2021 under the file number 402 AR 1947/21, I filed a criminal complaint for extortion of protection money against the judge at the District Court of Fulda, Ballmeyer, on March 15, 2021. The public prosecutor at the Fulda Public Prosecutor's Office, Wilk, other unknown persons from the Fulda judicial authorities, and against 3 officers from the Fulda Criminal Police. In the criminal complaint, I refer to my conviction from 2003 and to the fact that the extortion of protection money I experienced can be made credible as soon as I have the business data from Wirecard, and it thus can be proven that the German judicial authorities and politicians were systematically extorting protection money. With reference to the circumstances mentioned, I informed the Munich Public Prosecutor's Office in my letter of March 2, 2023. You can certainly understand that it must seem like a parody to me, 15 years after I was sentenced by the Fulda District Court, under file number 2G6412/02 after my refusal to pay protection money to a corrupt judiciary. Of all things, I had the opportunity to see through the business structures of the company, in which the corrupt German judiciary has washed the protection money extorted on the black market. The letter went unanswered.